Welcome to Heartfelt Tales, where every story tugs at your heartstrings and leaves you thinking long after it's over. Today, we have a tale that is as powerful as it is emotional. A story of resilience, hope, and unwavering determination. A story of one man's fight against impossible odds, and how his journey could inspire change for an entire community. But this isn't just any tale, it's about a man who refused to let his town's future slip away, even when everything seemed lost. You'll learn about the hardships of living in a forgotten town, a town once built on the backs of hardworking miners. The struggle, the despair, and the spark of hope that rose from the ashes. Trust me, you'll want to stay with us until the very end, because the twists, turns, and ultimate triumph will leave you speechless. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss another story that touches your soul. Now, let's dive into this unforgettable journey of resilience, hope, and an undying will to survive. The town of Miners, West Virginia, a land of miners, of dusty coal roads, of dreams soaked in sweat and hardship. Here, from the moment they are born, everyone knows their life is tied to the earth. The men grow up with a pickaxe, a helmet, and a flashlight flickering in the darkness of the deep mine. But that was the past. Now, West Virginia is but a faded shadow of its former self. The streets that once echoed with laughter are now silent. The small shops have slowly closed, and "for sale" signs hang loosely on many old houses. During the day, the men sit idly on their porches, staring at the abandoned coal mines. At night, the lights in the town go out early, as if no one wants to stay up late dreaming of the future. In the midst of this land, there is one man who refuses to give up hope, Jim Carter. Jim Carter, a resilient miner. Jim Carter is a true miner. He was born and raised in this town, growing up with the sound of drilling and the smell of coal embedded in his skin. His father, Henry Carter, was also a miner. He once said that every time he stepped into the mine, he felt like a warrior, going into the earth to bring light back to his family. Jim believed those words. When he turned 18, he followed his father down into the mine and worked there for over 20 years. But now, everything has changed. 3 years ago, the coal mine where he worked announced it was closing. The coal company could no longer maintain operations due to policies restricting fossil fuel extraction. One day, the company's director stood before hundreds of workers and quietly announced, "We are very sorry, but this is your last day here." The crowd fell silent. Jim gripped his helmet tightly, feeling as though the world was collapsing around him. Jim's family, a dream shattered. After losing his job, Jim struggled with various odd jobs. He worked as a warehouse laborer, repaired machinery in town, and even drove trucks. But the money he earned couldn't compare to what he had made in the mine. At home, Mary, his wife, grew increasingly worried. She was a primary school teacher, but the local school was also on the brink of closing due to too many families leaving town. "Jim, have you thought about leaving here?" One evening, Mary asked. Jim looked at his wife, then turned to look at Ethan, their 14-year-old son. Ethan had once dreamed of becoming a miner like his father. But now, he no longer wanted to talk about it. "We can't keep waiting for a miracle," Mary continued, her voice choking. "If we stay here, Ethan will have no future." Jim clenched his fists. He knew his wife was right. But how could he leave this town? How could he abandon the place where his father and grandfather had lived their whole lives? "We won't leave," Jim whispered. "I can't give up." Mary looked at her husband, her eyes filled with sadness. Hard times. Month after month, Jim's family's situation worsened. They were behind on rent, and bills piled up. Sometimes, Mary had to work extra hours, while Jim took every job he could find. But no matter how much they worked, they were just getting by. It wasn't just Jim's family, the whole town was drowning in the darkness of despair. Lisa, their neighbor, had once worked as an office clerk for the coal company, now working part-time at the grocery store. She had lived here her whole life, but now she faced the prospect of losing her house because she couldn't afford the rent. "Jim, do you think things will ever go back to the way they were?" Lisa asked one evening as they stood outside their houses. Jim was silent. He wanted to believe that they would, but the truth was, no one knew what would happen. The miners' protest one autumn day, hundreds of townspeople gathered outside the state government building, holding up signs, "Reopen the coal mines. We need jobs." Jim was among the crowd. They shouted, they demanded, but all they received was silence. "No one cares about us," a man standing next to Jim muttered. "They want the coal industry to die." Jim clenched his fists. He couldn't accept that. He remembered the old days when his father came home from the mine with a bright smile, announcing that the company had secured a new contract. He remembered those dinners when they would sit at the table, telling Ethan about coal mining, the pride of being a miner. He didn't want that to become a thing of the past. But the harsh reality was, everything was fading away. Faint Hope, Indiana. The days following the protest, Jim began to lose hope. He started considering giving up, thinking about selling their small house and moving the family to a city. Then one day, while repairing an old drill in the backyard, Jim heard his neighbor shout, "Jim! Have you seen the news?" Jim rushed into the house, turned on the old TV. On the screen, a man with golden hair and a black suit was speaking to a huge crowd. "Donald Trump. We will bring jobs back to America. We will reopen the coal mines. We will make America great again." The hall erupted in applause. Jim stood still. Was this the moment he had been waiting for? A glimmer of hope flickered in the heart of the old miner. But was it just an empty promise, or was it the light at the end of the tunnel? Part 2, The Conflict Begins, A Glimmer of Hope. A glimmer of hope in the dark. Jim Carter stood still in front of the TV screen, his eyes fixed on the image of Donald Trump speaking before a crowd of thousands. The promises about reopening the coal industry, creating jobs, and providing hope for workers like him struck at the heart of his pain. Mary walked over and placed her hand on Jim's shoulder. "What do you think?" Jim took a deep breath. He wasn't easily swayed by political speeches, but this time, something felt different. "I don't know, but maybe this is our last chance." Mary looked at him, her eyes filled with concern. She had seen too many empty promises, but never any results. But Jim couldn't stop himself from hoping. For the first time in years, someone was speaking up, saying they would help people like him. Waiting time, the doubts in the days that followed, the town was filled with debates. Lisa's small coffee shop became the gathering place for unemployed men, each one discussing what they had heard on the news. "He won't be able to do it." An old man sighed. "They've said that many times before. But this time is different." A young man retorted. "Trump isn't like the other politicians. He's a businessman. He knows how to revive the economy." Jim sat quietly, listening to everything. Inside, hope and skepticism waged war. Would Trump really keep his word? Or was this just another fleeting dream? Executive order, a moment of joy. Then one day, shocking news spread throughout the town. President Donald Trump had signed an executive order removing barriers for the mining industry. Jim couldn't believe his ears. He immediately grabbed his phone, reading and rereading the article. The Trump administration has officially removed restrictions on coal and mineral extraction. Mining companies will be able to restart operations and reopen thousands of mines that have been closed for the past decade. Jim's heart raced. Does this mean they will have jobs again? Soon, a large meeting was held at City Hall. Representatives from mining companies announced that they would restart projects in West Virginia within the next 6 months. Cheers erupted throughout the hall. People hugged each other, crying tears of joy. Jim grabbed Mary's hand. Finally, after so many years, they had a chance to rebuild. The return of the coal mine, it won't be easy. The following months brought life back to the town. Trucks rolled in, and companies began rehiring workers. Jim was one of the first to be called back to the mine. The first day he stepped back into the mine after many years, the familiar feeling flooded back. But there was a problem: the mine had been abandoned for too long. Equipment was damaged, tunnels had collapsed, and the restoration wasn't as easy as they had hoped. Everyone had to work twice, even 3 times harder to repair the systems. Many began to lose hope. "I don't think we can do it," a colleague of Jim sighed. "No," Jim said firmly. "We've waited too long for this opportunity. We can't give up now." He worked tirelessly, inspiring those around him. If this was their last chance, he would do everything in his power to make it a reality. The first day of production 6 months later, the coal mine officially resumed operations. On the first day the trucks filled with coal left the mine, the entire town erupted in joy. Jim watched as the trucks drove off, his heart swelling with pride. He had once thought this day would never come. Mary ran to embrace him, her eyes red. "You did it, Jim." Ethan looked at his father, his eyes full of admiration. "I want to be a miner like you, Dad." Jim squeezed his son's shoulder. This was what he had fought to regain, not just a job, but hope for the next generation. Part 3, the climax, the storm before dawn. Success and pride. The coal mine officially reopened, bringing not only a job back to Jim but also to hundreds of families in the town. The once silent streets were bustling again. Lisa's coffee shop was filled every morning. Children could play without hearing their parents complain about utility bills. Jim stood on a hill, looking down at the bright lights of the town. He knew this wasn't just a job, it was a revival. "We did it," he said to Mary, his voice filled with emotion. "Thanks to who?" She smiled playfully. Jim laughed. He knew exactly who made this happen. The storm approaches, but the joy didn't last long. One morning, news on TV shocked the whole town. Politicians opposing the coal mining policy are pressuring to reverse President Trump's executive order. They argue that mining harms the environment and want to shut down the mines again. Jim felt the blood boil in his veins. They wanted to take away what they had just earned back. No one in the town could believe it. They had seen how their lives had changed, how hope had sparked in the eyes of their children. And now, all of that was at risk of being extinguished. The call from Washington. A few days later, a special announcement aired on television. President Trump will give an important speech about the mining industry in one of the towns that has been revived thanks to his policies. Jim's town had been chosen. The news spread like wildfire. The day before the event, the whole town prepared to welcome the president who had changed their lives. The historic meeting that morning, Jim wore his cleanest work clothes. He never imagined he'd have the chance to be close to the president, but this was the man who had helped him regain his life. He wanted to show his gratitude. Black SUVs rolled into the town square, and the crowd cheered as the president stepped out. Donald Trump stood at the podium, waving to the crowd. He scanned the crowd with a determined look in his eyes. "When I took office, they told me that towns like this were dead." The crowd went silent. "I didn't believe that. I believe in you. And you've proven me right." The applause thundered like a storm. Then, unexpectedly, Trump looked directly at Jim. "Jim Carter, are you here?" The whole town turned to look at Jim. His heart skipped a beat. How did he know his name? People pushed him forward. He walked, his heart pounding, until he stood right in front of the president. Trump extended his hand. Jim looked into his eyes, and in that moment, he realized that this wasn't just a politician, this was the man who had fought for them. He shook his hand firmly. "Thank you, sir." Trump nodded. "You and the people here have done your part. And I promise you, I won't let anyone take your jobs away." Jim knew, this wasn't an empty promise. Part 4, the backlash, the final storm. The political storm in the days following President Trump's speech, the town was filled with renewed hope. They believed their jobs were now secure. But soon, the storm rolled in. Politicians opposed to Trump launched a series of campaigns aimed at stopping the coal mining policy. They held press conferences, criticizing that coal mining would harm the environment and that America should focus on clean energy instead of returning to the past. Environmental activists appeared on TV constantly, talking about the dangers of emissions and global warming. The people in town didn't believe in that. They only saw that without this job, their families would fall into poverty once again. Jim looked at his wife. Mary's eyes were full of worry. If they shut down the mine again, what will we do? Jim didn't answer. He knew that if that happened, everything would collapse. Fighting for the future, unable to sit back and watch, Jim and the other miners decided to stand up and protect their jobs. They organized peaceful marches, carrying signs, "We don't want handouts, we want to work. Let coal help us feed our families." Jim was invited to speak in front of the crowd. For the first time in his life, he stood before hundreds of people, in front of television cameras, to speak his mind. "I'm not a politician. I'm just an ordinary man, a miner, a father." He looked around and saw familiar faces, people who had lost everything and had just gotten their lives back. "We don't want to sit at home and receive handouts. We just want to work. If you close the coal mines, do you dare to look our children in the eyes and say their future isn't worth it?" Applause rang out. Tears streamed down the faces of the townspeople. Trump responds. The protests spread across coal-producing states. Trump knew he couldn't stay on the sidelines. One evening, Jim received an unexpected call from an unknown number. "Jim, this is Donald Trump." Jim nearly dropped the phone. "I've heard your story." Jim was speechless. He never thought the president would actually know who he was. "I promised you that I would protect your jobs. And I will keep my word." Jim didn't know what to say, he could only choke out a thank you. A few days later, Trump held a press conference at the White House, announcing that he would not let politicians destroy the coal industry. "They want to close the coal mines. I say no. They want to take away the jobs of millions of Americans. I will not let that happen." The crowd erupted in cheers. Jim knew this was the final battle, and they had a leader. Part 5, The Unraveling, Victory After the Storm. Facing off after President Trump's strong declaration, the battle between supporters and opponents of coal mining grew more intense than ever before. Jim and the town's residents followed the news daily, anxious about whether Trump's policy could withstand the pressure from politicians and green energy corporations. One day, Jim received a call from a major television network. They wanted him to appear on a debate show with a famous environmental activist. Mary grasped her husband's hand, worried. "You don't have to do this, Jim. They'll just try to smear you." Jim took a deep breath. "No, Mary. If I don't speak up, who will? This isn't just my fight, it's the whole town's." The heated debate on live television, Jim faced off against a well-dressed man representing an environmental protection organization. The host began, "Mr. Jim Carter, can you explain why you believe coal mining should continue, despite concerns about the environment?" Jim clenched his fists, looking directly into the camera. "Look at the numbers instead of the slogans. This mine has provided jobs for thousands of families. It's not just about energy, it's about life." The man opposite him frowned, "But you can't deny that coal pollutes the environment. We need to move towards renewable energy." Jim gave a bitter smile. "Have you ever thought about how families will live if you close the coal mines? Have you ever stood in front of your son and said, 'Son, I can't feed you because some people believe coal isn't good'?" The room fell silent for a few seconds. The host was also taken aback by Jim's sincerity. The debate continued, but by the end, Jim had touched the hearts of millions of viewers. Victory by the skin of one's teeth. A few weeks after the debate, Congress voted on whether or not to continue the coal mining policy. The media reported continuously. Everyone held their breath, waiting. And then, the news finally arrived: the Trump administration has successfully protected the coal mining policy. Coal mines in West Virginia and other states will continue to operate. The whole town erupted in joy. They had won. Jim knelt, embracing Mary and their son, tears streaming down his face. It wasn't just about jobs, it was about dignity, pride, and their future. The unexpected letter. A week later, Jim received an envelope from the White House. When he opened it, he couldn't believe his eyes. Jim Carter, thank you for fighting not just for yourself, but for all hardworking Americans. People like you make me believe that America is still great. Keep working hard. I will always stand by you. Donald J. Trump. Jim gripped the letter in his hands. He knew this wasn't just his victory, it was the victory of a generation of hardworking people. Outside, the sun shone brightly over the small town. The future was now secure.